Well, good evening, folks. It is Wednesday night, and I want to thank you for coming here. And I've got a whole one of you stacked up in there so far. James, how you doing? And I appreciate your being here. Thanks for coming. We are continuing our little voyage into the life of King David, and I want to call this, of course, the apologetic life of David. Uh, Pardon me for doing this on air. I forgot to do it before I started up. It has spray my throat. Hopefully, that will help me hold out tonight with my sore, raspy throat. And girl who knows no name, Becky, welcome. With no name, I'm sorry. And James, good to see you back. And so tonight we're going to continue this whole talk about David and the idea that the story that we were presented in the Bible is a great story of faith wrapped around a historical event. That is, David, the actual historical man who really did exist, no reason to believe he didn't, and the apologetic that the writers of David's story wanted the reader to take away. And that is that David was the sweet psalmist of Israel, that he was the giant slayer, and that he was this man that was after God's own heart. When in reality, he was a normal guy. I don't think there was anything quite exceptional about David in the way of being a Middle Eastern monarch in the making, a Middle Eastern king once he got there. I don't think there was anything unique about him in the Middle East as a Middle Eastern king. Other than that, he was a valiant man of war. He coalesced the tribes in northern Israel as best he could, and he ruled as the king for quite a long time. So, those are the things that we've been talking about the last several nights on this. This is number 8 in the series, and we're going to just continue on tonight. We've already gotten all the way up now for all the pre-life stuff about David leading up to his actually taking the throne and the kingship of Judah, which was not all of Israel yet at this point. And so Judah is where he grew up, in the hills of Judah. So what David has ahead of him is the task of unifying all these territorial clans, if you will. And at the same time, we've got the death of Saul we just went through, and David now not being handed the kingship on a silver platter. Remember, people saw David for what he was. He was somebody that was trying to lead a coup. He was trying to take the throne from Saul. And Saul tried to kill him as a result, as he rightfully would have under the traditions of the day. And so Saul is now dead. And David possesses the crown and the ringlet, the arm ringlet of Saul. But he doesn't automatically get to become king. So we're going to dig into that tonight. How David became king, and really the bloody list he had to go through to get himself there, which you will see is also written in an apologetic to make David look better than he was. Not just a murdering scumbag trying to reach the throne, but the man still after God's own heart. And so I guess it's all about how many times you apologize and ask God to forgive you wipes out all the sin that you've brought to the table, is what they're going to try to do here. Now, Suze, welcome to the table. Glad to have you here tonight. And as you know, we are working very hard to try to get all our schedules to mesh. Rocky Stucci and I will be on with the Situation Room tonight, and hopefully I'll maintain my brain until we get there. I'm a little brain dead tonight, so it's a good thing I have notes to go by here, and I do have passion behind this, so hopefully that comes through. So we've got Rocky Stucci's and my the Situation Room at 11 Central, midnight Eastern. After this show, we'll have a brief pause in between. Jeff, I think, is trying to stick to a 7 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time. And we're going to try to get a schedule that works where he's at 7, I'm at 9, Rocky's at 11, and that kind of a thing. So hopefully this will all coalesce very soon in the near future. I have my water. I have my throat sprayed. So hopefully I won't lose my voice midway through the process tonight. I could get into a few current events at the upshot, but I don't want to get into anything deep at all. I'm just mildly disgusted these days with how, like George Orwell said, and this isn't a direct quote, it's almost direct. It's not verbatim. He said this pretty much. He said, the more people start to tell the truth, the more they will be attacked for it. And this is what I'm seeing out there. People don't want to tell the truth. They want to operate out of emotions. They want to operate out of feelings. This whole thing on the southern border, the whole fake tears from Ocasio-Cortez down on the border over the last day. All of that, it's virtue signaling. We don't need virtue signaling. We need people to stand up and do the right thing, to use common sense, incorporate your common sense. And this whole thing has me just a little off kilter. So today on Rocky's show, The Situation Room, this is going to be our last political night of the week. Tomorrow, Friday night, technically Thursday night, if you're in the Midwest, is going to be our Politics-Free Friday. So I'm looking forward to that, where we can get into some other things. So hopefully we'll clear our brains a little bit tonight, get that plate served up to you at 11, and go from that. And for now, let's get back into the life of David. And I don't need to recap so much for those who are here already. As you know, Saul has met his death, and David is now going to become the king of Judah. And in the modern imagination, Saul is succeeded directly by David. This is what we were taught in Sunday school and even in seminary and Bible college, because the Bible story makes it seem as though David stepped right into the kingship. And this is what we're taught in religious school. This is what we find in most introductory overviews of the Israelite monarchy. And given the biblical presentation that we've been going through, it's a natural assumption when you read it the way it's written. After all, David's predestined to be the king. He's been appointed by God, and God's prophet Samuel anointed him. And God himself is said to have stripped Saul of the kingship in order to give it to David. And after Saul's death, it would seem pretty self-evident then that David, who after all literally held Saul's crown in his hand, would ascend to the throne and begin his glorious reign over all of Israel. He was destined for this. He was the man after God's own heart, the sweet psalmist of Israel, the one who would not take the king's life, would not lay his hand against Yahweh's anointed. And that was repeated so many times in the story of David leading up to this point that we know probably the opposite happened, is that David would really seek to take Saul's life. And so now this version of events is highly abbreviated. David would eventually become king in Saul's place, to be sure, but his path to the crown was hardly easy, and it wasn't straightforward. It wasn't just because he had the crown in his hand, and now he was there, and he could claim that the prophet anointed him. People weren't behind him. And so now we, as the readers of the Bible, are prepared for it well in advance. But the inhabitants of Israel at the time and Judah had no such foreknowledge of David. And there was no reason to assume that David was entitled to rule them. Here's all these people saying, well, you know what? We didn't ask for David. If Samuel anointed him, he's got to prove himself still. And it would have been quite the contrary. As a matter of fact, the people didn't really want him, as we saw with some of his episodes while he's out in the wilderness running from Saul. And David, remember, had effectively given up his membership in the community of Judah by going over to the Philistines. So not only was he being chased by Saul, As we saw last night, especially, David ineffectively left Israel. He left his allegiance to Israel behind when he became Habiru. He became a mercenary king. I'm sorry, a mercenary warrior, fighting for the Philistines. And the king of Philistia, Achish, even gave him the town Ziklag as his stronghold. And so he'd given up all rights, so to speak. And the people saw this. And he never really belonged to Israel, the northern territories over which Saul had ruled. He wasn't a member of the royal family. Indeed, as we've seen, David likely played this direct role in the death of Saul and his sons. If he didn't do it himself, he had his men of valor do it. If you remember, even the story where it says Saul relieved himself in the cave and David went up and cut off a piece of his robe and then showed it to him. It was David's men that were like, David, there's Saul. Kill him now. And David said, I will not lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. And maybe there was some of that with David. He wasn't going to outright take Saul's life, but he could have. I think David wanted him dead, though. And from an Israelite perspective, David had about as much right to rule as did a Philistine at this point. So let's look at David as the king of Judah. It's this that's a bit surprising from a historical perspective, that directly after Saul's defeat and death, David should be anointed king, though not over all of Israel, but rather over only Judah to the south. And the biblical account of this event is startling because mostly due to its brevity. It just states that this happened, and boom, David's king. And in a mere 4 verses in 2 Samuel 2, 1 through 4, we're told that David went to Hebron with his wives and his faithful followers and settled there, and that the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And for a seminal moment in David's royal career, the basic facts are all the Bible, the biblical authors give us. That's all they tell us. Just here, let's just say David went to Hebron with his wives and he was crowned king by the men of Judah. Boom, done. David's king. In relation to the other details of the story that were written before that. And so it's brief, it's to the point, and it's so short as to not be believed to be the only way this happened. The text raises a number of questions that have to be answered, and there's gaps that have to be filled. This is what you have to do, folks, with even familiar Bible stories and stories of faith. Remember, I've always said the Bible is a book of faith, but those faith stories are wrapped around real historical events. So you can take the or leave the faith portion. That's a personal choice, but the history is the history. So there is a history of David here. Problem is the faith story is wrapped around it. And so the questions that have to be raised, why, for instance, does David go to Hebron? What about the town of Hebron is important? Who are the men of Judah that come and crown him there? How did popular acclaim function as a mechanism for anointing a king? And why did the Judahites anoint David in the first place? What were the practical implications of David's new position? You got to ask all these questions. The haste with which the Bible describes David anointing in Hebron may suggest that there's more to this event than meets the eye, and surely it wasn't as simple as all of that. But what the narrative in the apologetic form is trying to tell you is that everybody's just aching for David to be the king, because David has been built up, Saul has been diminished as a madman, as a jealous king, somebody who's out to kill David, who is the righteous choice. That's what they're building you up to. So naturally, when Saul's dead, David steps right into the kingship. That's what they want you to believe. David's choice of the city of Hebron as his new residence, and in fact, as his capital in Judah, They don't have Jerusalem yet. This was a strategic choice. The city sits squarely in the middle of the hill country of Judah, in one of the highest areas of the region. Already 1,000 years before David, Hebron was one of the most significant cities in that it would eventually be called Judah. It was both a cultic site, and what I mean by cultic site is a place of worship, and more importantly, it was a royal city encircled by a massive wall, an administrative center from which the surrounding area was controlled. And the significance of Hebron in the region is evident from its prominence in early biblical traditions. It's in Hebron, or Hebron, you can say it any way you want, that Abraham dwells, and that the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried, with the exception of Rachel and Isaac, if you remember. And when Moses sends spies to go explore the hill country, they go to Hebron. For someone with the royal aspirations, there could be no more important symbolic place to be anointed than in the ancient royal city of Hebron. It had a hell of a lot of significance to the Israelites. And so you see David going there. There's so much in Israel's history that surrounded Hebron that this was the place to be. What's not obvious at the first glance, though, is how odd it is that David should have relocated to Hebron at all. Since we know he will become king there, the move seems kind of natural. Yet, it's this same David who, fewer than 2 years earlier, was unable to find even temporary shelter among the inhabitants of Judah. All the towns, remember Zelek, I can't remember the exact name, Ziph, Keilah, those towns, he was unable to find any kind of temporary housing there or support. The towns and regions far less important than Hebron, for these towns I mentioned, for example, were all too happy to turn David down and to turn David in. And they pushed him aside. Yet suddenly, without any commentary on it in the passage, David is able to settle himself, his family, all of his men, all their families, in one of the largest and most important cities in Judah. Something's changed now. The air is shifted. In fact, two significant transformations have occurred since David, 2 years earlier, last found himself in the hills of Judah. The first is the defeat and the death of Saul. When David first entered the wilderness, Saul was powerful. He had his army behind him. He was powerful enough to regularly send search parties after David, and for David to be afraid to engage those search parties because of their professionalism, probably the numbers, and he was to be viewed by the Judahites as the better bet, so to speak. To all appearances, Saul and his army had the upper hand in the conflict against David and his ragtag militia. Pardon me again. It's going to be a couple more weeks with this cough, so I am told. And I think I'm using my voice properly. I'm speaking from my diaphragm, and so your stage voice, but you get a little more casual when I'm in a close vicinity like this. So, pardon my voice. So, by the way, I'm going to check one thing while I'm sitting here. Just want to make sure my sound is better than it was last night. Yeah, we are all set. I'm using this mic, and if you hear the tap, you know that I'm on the right mic tonight. Let's see. I'm just going to go over before I go forward, and I'm going to look back in. Susie Q, it's okay that you're late. No big deal. You can always go back and check it out later. We've only been going for about 20 minutes, so we're good. Let's see. So it's good to have you here. Audrey, nice to have you. What's up? Let's see. Anybody else new I need to say hello to at this point? Nope, not yet. I think I'm competing with Jeff again tonight. I've only got 4 people lined up in here, but that's okay. I'm here for you. The show goes on. It's not about me and my time. It's about you and your time. And I appreciate you being here. So thanks. And anybody else, later, they can either join us or they can check this out in the archives. So it's good to have you all here. All right. So now the second change here is, by the way, with Saul's death, there was no longer a greater, larger, stronger force for David to contend with. And so, they weren't there to stand behind the Judahites. So, and their denials of David. So the wind has changed a bit on that. The second change is this rise in David's military power during his time among the Philistines. No longer is he this relatively ill-equipped gang scrounging the wilderness for supplies from their hole in the wall, the cave of Adullam, I'm sorry. No longer are they scrounging that way, but they're supplied now. And they've got supplies from their many months of raids. They've got cattle. They've got livestock. They've got gold. And also they've got most certainly improved arms, thanks to the Philistines whom they served. And David didn't move out of desperation any longer. Now his movements are very well calculated. They were always calculated, but sometimes he had to move and fly because he was being chased. Now he can calculate his own move. He's got nobody chasing him down. And if he relocated to Hebron, it was because he had the power to maintain his presence there. And especially in the vacuum created by the absence of Saul's military counterweight. Now, keep in mind, Saul, his sons are dead. And but his army is still there. His general is still there. So I'm thinking that things took place rather quickly, but not as quickly as we might be led to believe. The point then is that it wasn't the attitude of the Judahites toward David that changed. Indeed, after more than a year of David's regular raids from Philistia, it was likely that their feelings had only hardened against David. He's raiding all these towns in Judah, his own people. What changed was their ability to do anything about it. They couldn't go tattling to Saul. This is all to suggest that David's move to Hebron is less a mere relocation and more an act of aggression. He's the aggressor here. He is moving aggressively into Hebron. Note how his settlement there replicates that of the Philistines in the north. After the defeat of the Israelite army, the Philistines occupied the conquered territory. That they could settle their own people in Israel without the native populace being able to prevent it signaled Israel's complete subjugation, at least in the north, to the Philistines. And they couldn't answer the call once the king, his son, and his armies were wiped out on Mount Gilboa. And this is especially true in a culture that like that of ancient Israel, in which familial possession of the land was of the utmost importance. It was protected by custom and law. It was rare enough for an Israelite to move within Israel. An outsider settling in the land would have been an indication of the people's abject weakness. Settlement equals possession in these times. And it's a mark of power. And so to David in the south moves to the very heart of Judah, to one of its oldest and most famous cities. And by settling in Hebron, he makes a bold statement about his strength relative to that of the inhabitants of Judah. And they once may have been able to push him away, but now they have nothing they can do about David coming in. So David is coming in as an occupier. Remember, the people see him not as Israelite or Judahite anymore. They see him as Philistine. But David now moves in, takes that city for himself, and is taking that region for himself. You know, something popped into my mind as I was talking about this familial possession. Go to YouTube. open up another window and you can look for it. You don't have to undo listening to me right now. Another time, or open up another window. Look for, there's a music video. And of all people, I think it's the old crooner Andy Williams. Now, if you're old like me, you remember Andy Williams doing his Christmas specials on television and all of that. He had a beautiful voice, but of a different time. And now Andy Williams does this song. If you remember the movie Exodus, it was taken from Leon Uris's book of the same name, Exodus. And it's about the founding of the new state of Israel after World War II, and how the ships would run the blockades and beach themselves on the shores of Israel, which was then known as Palestine. And the British ruled there and held that property. And many times these people, they would set up kibbutzes, farms from the early 1900s and on. And that's how they were taking over, gradually taking back Israel after thousands of years of not being there. And so the people would run the ships aground, and then the British would round them up and put them into concentration camps in Israel. Now, or at least detainment camps. If I'm going to stick to the current meter of the day about concentration camps during detainment camps, they weren't killing anybody. They weren't trying to wipe them out. But the Brits rounded them up and put them in these detainment centers, these tent cities. They weren't intending to kill them or do away with them. They just didn't know what to do with them. And so they were coming from concentration camps, being liberated in Europe, and landing in what they believed was going to be their homeland. It was their ancestral homeland, and they were being rounded up and put in detention centers. So anyway, where I was going, that's the book and the movie I'm talking about, Exodus. And if you remember the theme music from Exodus, that bum 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 bum, the piece of music. You've heard it before. If not in an elevator, on the movie itself, you've seen this. The piece somewhere, from somewhere. Well, there was a little video put together. It's done with animation, cartooning, that shows from primeval times or prehistoric times, all the way up to present day, the possession of the land of Israel, as Andy Williams is singing Exodus in the background, that theme song from that movie that came out in 1957, I think it was. So, or it might have been 60. Yep, Paul Newman. See James Sheets. Paul Newman starred as Ari Ben Canaan in that movie. He was the lead character in the book. So go look that up. Andy Williams singing Exodus, and the animated thing, and you'll see it's a very good video. Talking about familial possession of the land is what made me think of that. And it shows all these groups down through the thousands of years that have gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth in the land of Israel. All right. So let's move forward now. Hebron was this logical choice for David. There was no other reason he was there. It was logical. It was the main city of the Calebite tribe. Remember, David, when there is conjecture, pretty good speculation, that Nabal was the Calebite chief of the Calebite clan. And you will find that in the scripture in 1 Samuel. Well, when Nabal dies, he takes familial possession of Nabal's land by taking his wife and Abigail. And so now he becomes really the ad hoc Calebite chieftain. And so now Hebron is the city that is smack in the center of the Calebite tribe. And the city of Hebron is granted specificity to Caleb, the tribe's eponymous ancestor. Remember Joshua and Caleb in the story of the Exodus. Once they get to the promised land, they sent out 12 spies. Joshua and Caleb were two of the spies that Moses sends out to see what's going on in the countryside. And they go to Hebron, to that region. And they say there are giants there. They make us look like grasshoppers in comparison. and the grapes are as big as our heads, things like that. And so the 12 tribes didn't want to go. They were all afraid. Joshua and Caleb were the only two guys that said, we can do this. We can go take the land. But God tells them no, and they go have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because God says nobody of this generation is going to survive to enter the promised land except Joshua and Caleb. And he promises Caleb this region of Hebron. And there was even a song we sang in the youth group that was called I Want This Mountain, because Caleb said, I want this mountain that the Lord has given me, which is Hebron. He says, I want this. I'm coming back for it after this long sojourn. And that little song was like, I want that mountain. I want that mountain. Where the milk and honey flow and the grapes of Eshcol grow. I want that mountain. I want that mountain. The mountain that the Lord has given me. And this was this pithy little youth group song we used to sing about Caleb because of his courage and because of his convictions and so on, given this land. So this is what we're talking about, that same Hebron. And it's granted specifically to Caleb. And you'll find that in Numbers 13 and 14. So Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and assigned Hebron to him as his portion. And that's Joshua 14:13. Now, David's move to Hebron was more than merely symbolic. He was making good on his right to be the Calebite chief, a right he claimed when he killed Nabal and married Abigail. And at the time, he was unable to assume the position because he had not yet amassed enough power to hold it. But that was then. This is now. And although the death of Saul may have been precipitating events for David's incursion into the heart of Judah, his movements were not unplanned, laying in the groundwork for the establishment of his power in Judah for quite a long while. And we saw that, we mentioned that last night. David is lining things up for when he can gain power. Didn't know he was going to get it, but that was his goal, was to push for that. And beginning with his marriage to Abigail, that was his first step, as we mentioned last night. And it seems likely that the entire time that David was among the Philistines, he was intended to prepare for just this eventuality. We've seen David's main activity during the 16 months of his residence in Ziklag, when he was Habiru, he was mercenary to King Achish of the Philistines, was the regular raiding of Judahite towns. Now, while such raids had obvious economic benefits, we shouldn't overstate the tangible rewards that resulted from them. These towns were not major centers of commerce. They weren't blessed with agriculture or material abundance. You'd still go see them archaeologically, by the way. What could be captured in a raid was probably hardly enough to justify the expense of mounting the expedition in the first place. They were little dust bowls. And from the Judahite perspective, the raids weren't economically crippling. There's no evidence that any Judahite community was destroyed, abandoned, or even deeply harmed by these Philistine advances. We might note the example of Keilah, discussed in the previous presentation last night, that David's raids were, as such minor attacks usually are, less about tangible reward and more about kind of peeing on the fire hydrant. He's saying, this place is mine. And the message he was sending was, this is mine, back off. And he entered later Judah unopposed. And to leave without being pursued sent a clear signal of regional dominance on the part of David. His raids were aimed not at Judah's economy, but at its psyche. David is mind-fucking the inhabitants of Judah, to be very blunt and clear. This is what he's doing. He is showing that he is the growing power there, and he will remain the power there. And the Judahites wouldn't have known where or when David might strike, and they'd have to be constantly on the guard, constantly reminded of their susceptibility to attack. And in his time with the Philistines, David established himself as a pretty damned fearsome presence. especially in Judah. And so this is what he's doing. He's racking up his presence, baking the Judahite psyche and laying the groundwork for when he would eventually seek the kingship. And at the same time, though, he was taking a very different tack, the one that contributed to the same basic ends. In 1 Samuel 30, we're told that David sent some of the spoil he'd captured to the elders of Judah. Ching, 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 ching. Payoff time. The text is suggesting here that this spoil was from David's vengeful attack on the Amalekites, who had captured Ziklag. But we've already seen that story is a patent apology for David's participation in the battle against Saul. Remember that? David says he wants to stay and fight with Achish. Achish sends him away to Ziklag. And there David chases down the Amalekites that stole his wives, his children, and all the people. Yet when he gets them, they're all unharmed. Not a hair of their head is even out of place. No one's raped, no one's pillaged, no one's killed. Which pretty much says that the story was a lie. It was a fake. It was a cover story for what David was probably really doing, and that was participating in the Philistine battle against Saul and his son Jonathan, David's beloved friend, on the slopes of Mount Gilboa, where those two both died. So the text suggests that the spoil was from the Amalekites that David fictionally chased down. So the notice of David sending spoil to Judah may contribute to this apologetic end. In theory, the receipt of the spoils from David would prove that he wasn't on the battlefield fighting Saul because he was chasing down the Amalekites. Yet, the notice seems, unlike the rest of the story, to have a ring of truth to it. In fact, it may well be further evidence of David's concerted efforts to establish himself as the power figure in Judah. I think the cover story was the chasing of the Amalekites. David really did put out a little bit of ching to these clan chieftains in Judah. Now, we may note that the detailed list of the towns to which David is said to have sent these spoils: Bethel, Ramoth Negeb, Jatir, Aroer, Sifmoth, Esthemus, Rakal, Hormah, Bor Eshan, and Athak, as well as the regions of the Jerahmeelites and the Kenites. All of these Judahite towns are clustered in the south, near the top of the Negev desert. Now, what's notable about this list is that it matches almost perfectly the list of areas that David told Achish he had raided, when, according to the biblical author, he was in fact raiding various tribes to the south. David told Achish in 1 Samuel 27 that he was raiding the Negev of Judah, or the Negev of the Jerahmeelites, or the Negev of the Kenites. Now, we've already seen that David almost certainly did raid those territories, which means that he also seems to have sent spoils to precisely the same places. And by the way, if you hear shouting in the background, if it sounds like EVPs in the background, it's really just my wife dealing with surly children. You know, you get the impression through these broadcasts that my kids are pretty naughty. And I will tell you this, my kids wear sometimes on my wife's last fucking nerve. Mine too sometimes. And it's not that they're being bad. It's that they're doing the typical thing that kids don't do. They don't listen. They don't do what they're told. They are constantly hanging on my wife when she's trying to accomplish other things around the house. And so we have kids. If any of you have kids, you get the idea. You know what I'm talking about. So, yeah, you thought that was on your end, Audrey? Yes, my kids are lively. They're only naughty in the sense. How do I say this? I'm a doting father, so I have to be I'm biased about my children. So I will say my kids aren't bad kids at all. They're a little naughty. They have been taught to think for themselves, so much so that they drive my wife insane. And bless her heart for telling me it's okay to do your radio shows. I'm out here taking care of the kids. But sometimes there's a little spillage that you catch coming through my non-soundproofed walls. So there you go. So when I see there's a few more of you here, I just want to say hi. If anybody, Cynthia, it's great to see you. And Audrey's just leaving work. We'll see you when you get back for Rocky's show, I'm sure. Melinda, very good to see you. No apology for being late. You're here when you're here. You're here when you're supposed to be here. And if there's anything you want to go back and catch up on, you always can in the archives. I thank you and appreciate the fact that you're here. It means a lot to me. All right, so let's go on here with this story. So these towns are the same towns that David said he was raiding, and this is the same place he's sending his payoffs to these tribal chiefs. Now, the conclusion of this can be this: remarkably, confirmed by the biblical text itself, which describes the places to which David sent the spoils as all the places where David and his men had roamed. In 1 Samuel 30:31, it says that. Now, earlier, the biblical authors had unconvincingly told us that David did not, in fact, raid those regions, but had lied about doing so to appease Achish. Now, here, however, we're told that he and his men actually were in those places. Pardon me again, folks. As you know, this is going to go on for a little bit yet. This chest thing I got going. So, he actually was in those places, is what this tells us. And in other words, the cover-up, the cover story has slipped away momentarily. Oops, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Pay no attention to that raid behind the trees. It kind of slipped away. And this suggests that a historical account of David sending spoils to Judah, to the very towns he was raiding under Achish, has here been reconfigured to serve as part of the apology for David's whereabouts during the battle against Saul. Now they're covering up the battle against Saul and that David was more than likely there, not sent home by Achish, not chasing down the Amalekites, who did no harm with their raid on his town and his family. And the question then becomes, under what circumstances David really did send spoils to Judah, if it wasn't when the Bible says it was. So before coming to the when of this, we have to understand the why of this. How would it benefit David to redistribute to the towns of Judah the very spoils that he'd taken from them in the first place? As with the raids in which the spoils were captured, the sending of gifts back to Judah is more important for its symbolism than for its content. It sends this message: David has the power to take away, but he also has the power to benevolently give it back. So he's in this complete command situation. He's got the con. He's able to punish or reward as he sees fit. And David doesn't really need the spoils. He's not dependent on them for his survival. They're worthless to him. Their value is beyond value with the communities from which they were taken. And David, in controlling the spoils, is stating clearly his value to these communities as well. By taking and giving, David is saying, this can go one of two ways. You can oppose me in my quest to seek power, or you can support me. And you can see what each choice entails. So if this behavior seems familiar from the stories of the modern mafia, remember Nabal and sending men to Nabal? It's no coincidence. The knowledge of how to use power to control the population is as old as power itself. This is what David's doing. He's using his power to control the populace. Now, this is the sweet psalmist of Israel, by the way, the man after God's own heart. Keep telling yourself, keep reminding yourself of who we've been told David is compared to who we're learning he really was. And this giving of favors also has this distinctly royal tone. As we've already seen, early rule in Israel, as in many of the other cultures around it, was based on both military strength and a royal patronage. The ruler gained and kept the loyalty of his servants and his officers by proving himself capable of doling out favors to those close to him. And frankly, tell me the truth. If you were back then, wouldn't you, if you had the choice, you'd pony up to David? You'd ride alongside. You'd sidle up to next to him in the bar. You'd rather have David's favor because you know where he's going. And I'd rather be that. Otherwise, you spend the rest of your life being hunted and probably killed as a freedom fighter against David and to reestablish something that doesn't exist anymore, the house of Saul. So David seems to be doing this, but he doesn't need to count on the individuals, but on the communities. In distributing the spoils to the towns of Judah, David presents himself as a monarch. All of this leads to the strong possibility that the timing of David's distribution of spoils followed right on the heels of Saul's death. While Saul was still alive, these kinds of efforts might well have been wasted time, pearls before swine at that time, because nobody liked him. Whatever gifts David gave might have been able to, or whatever he had that he might have been able to offer, they hardly could match the military protection Saul offered. Once Saul had fallen, however, David was ready to fill the void. Saul wasn't even done twitching. And here is David distributing the spoils that served his purpose perfectly. They demonstrated his military power, since he was the one who had taken them in the first place, and his royal patronage. In short, David was telling the Judahites, I'm the best thing you've got, and I can offer you both protection and favor. Call it what you will, diplomacy, bribery, extortion. In the end, it seems to have all worked out for David. David wanted to present himself as a king, and a king is what he's becoming here. So this is how David became the king in Hebron, essentially by coercion. Less clear is the formal mechanism by which this is imagined to have happened. The biblical account says simply that the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king. That's 2 Samuel 2:4. But who are these guys? Who are the men of Judah? Who are the men of Judah that came and anointed him? Why did they come to Hebron? How did they anoint King David? To start, we have to remember that there was no unified tribe of Judah. So there wasn't like the tribe of Judah sent representatives. It just says the men of Judah. They can't be imagined to be this collective leadership group of Judah because there wasn't one, let alone literally all of the men of Judah. What we have to imagine is that the men of Judah refers to a leader or leaders from each community. And that doesn't take a lot of brain thought. This conforms to the notice of David sending spoils not to Judah as a whole, but to the elders of each town. Each community had to be dealt with independently by David. So how then did these independent communities each send one or more representatives to Hebron to anoint King David, or to anoint David king, at what would appear to be the same time? The biblical authors naturally want to present David's kingship as this collective, spontaneous act of joy. The people of Judah confirming that God himself had decreed in David's youth that he would be king. But concerted efforts like this require centralized leadership, which Judah didn't have. They were lacking that, or at least they did not have until the arrival of David. So if the towns in the regions of Judah sent all their leaders out, the men of Judah, to Hebron to see David, it's most logical to assume that they did so not of their own accord, but because they were summoned. What do you want to bet? Such a summons would, in fact, reflect standard ancient Near Eastern protocol. So, upon the assumption of the throne, kings would regularly require those lands subject to them to send representation, bearing tribute to him, the king. By appearing before the new king, these lands demonstrated their loyalty to the new regime and explicitly marked themselves as subservient to the royal overlord. This is precisely what we would expect to have happened with David at Hebron, especially because he had to ensure the loyalty not of one unified territory, but of each individual community, or at least enough of them to be certain that his control was secure. So it's even possible, though by no means certain in these events, that the summons to the communities of Judah to show themselves before David in Hebron was sent along with the redistribution of the spoils discussed above. And the function of the spoils was, as we've seen, to articulate David's power, to send this implicit either or choice, either you're with me or you're against me. And by sending the representatives to Hebron, communities publicly were demonstrating their choice and their acceptance of David's power. And this might not be because they accepted his power. What do we hear politically nowadays? He's not my president. Whatever. Shut up. That's what these people were doing. He's not my king, but I have to. So, such acceptance is in the end what the anointing of David entailed. So the men of Judah came and anointed David king, probably with their presents and their tributes. And probably David threw some feasts, I would guess. Probably David had some ceremony, wearing the crown, so on and so forth. So it was typically performed by an established authority figure in the name of the deity. Thus Moses anointed Aaron and his sons as priests. Samuel anoints Saul. Samuel anoints David as king. The priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan both anoint Solomon later on. Elijah anoints Jehu as king and Elisha as his prophetic successor. Anointing marked individuals as divinely ordained in their roles. And it seems likely in the story of David's anointing at Hebron, the literal meaning is not intended. We cannot suppose that all these representatives of Judah either individually or collectively poured oil over David's head. Rather, the symbolic import of anointing is alluded to here by acknowledging David's power, as I just said, recognizing his authority and granting it to him. At least in the eyes of the biblical authors, the divine right of kingship was bestowed upon David. And we can imagine that if any literal anointing occurred, it would have been by David's own hand. And as a sort of ancient Napoleon, when Napoleon crowned himself king, this is pretty much, I think, what David did. So with the acceptance of David's kingship, this new era has dawned in Israel. Not just for David, but for Judah, what was once a region of independent tribal communities. Pardon me. The more I talk, the more it dries out, but we'll do okay for a while. If you can put up with the coughing, I can put up with the scratchy. So what was once this region of independent communities, these tribal territories, for the first time is now unified under a single leader. What Saul had accomplished in the north, David now accomplished in the south. And the creation of the monarchy in Judah was at the same time the creation of Judah itself, because it was all splintered before. Now it's unified under David. So no matter how he got there, David has unified the south of Israel. Judah is the name of the territory. And it's here we hear for the first time the use of the term the house of Judah. David's achievement in this is absolutely undeniable. Whether apologetic, whether historical, it's undeniable. The house of Judah was established by David, considering the central role that Judah would play in history, literature, religion, all of these things. Without David, there would have been no Judah. Yet it should be remembered that at least at first, Judah was still only a very minor kingdom. The acknowledgement of David as king didn't suddenly make Judah into this amazing, powerful political or cultural force. It was still no more than a collection of backwater villages scattered in the wilderness among the hills. And though Judah would come to valorize David as its glorious founder, it came into being not by choice, but by coercion. It existed by the force of David's will. He made it happen. A will that he exerted with a heavy hand, a strong arm, strong sword, and it was really by the force of his will. Judah's glory years were still to come in history. And in fact, there's one further piece of the puzzle that makes the moment of Judah's creation even less triumphant than it appears. When we think of David becoming the king in Judah, we see in this the beginning of this great nation of Israel in its ancient version. We read the story through the lens of what followed, the history of Israel from David to the present. What's forgotten is the political situation after the death of Saul, and more important, David's own position. Saul's death may have been David's doing. David probably had his hand in that, as we talked about last night. One way or the other, David was part of it. But Israel was defeated by the Philistines when Saul died. It was the Philistines who had the power in the region. Now, David was, for all intents and purposes, a vassal of the Philistines. And as we've seen, he established his power from that position. The town of Ziklag, given to him by King Achish of the Philistines, was where David had lived. And now he's used all that power he accumulated during that time, and he's used that to establish himself as king in Judah. The death of Saul didn't change any of that. And neither did David's move to become the king of Judah. We have to imagine this scenario in which David, seizing his opportunities, left the embrace of the Philistines to establish himself as the king of a new independent state of Judah. Now, in such a case, we have to also imagine the Philistines' response to that. Here's the king Achish. This is his guy, David. He gave him a town. He's raiding in Judah. Helped him defeat Saul on Mount Gilboa. You got to imagine their response. They had overwhelming military advantage, especially with the collapse of the northern kingdom after Saul's death. David had been their loyal subject. They could hardly have allowed him to go off on his own and found a rival kingdom right in their backyard, right under the nose of King Achish. Pretty sure David didn't ask anybody's permission over in Philistia. In short, there would have been a significant Philistine response to this, and one that inevitably would have wiped Judah off the map before it even had a chance to defend itself. And yet none of this happened. David ruled over Judah and Hebron for 7 years, and during that time there's not a word of a single Philistine aggression. How can this be explained? What do you think was going on there? The answer is as obvious as it is unpalatable, especially when you think of who David is and what we learned about him. Judah, David's new kingdom, was effectively a Philistine territory. And for his entire tenure in Hebron, David remained a loyal vassal of the Philistines. This is why he could do what he was doing without being attacked. This might be hard to hear, but if you're Jewish, it's hard to hear. If you're Christian, it's hard to hear. But you got to think of this. It makes perfect sense. Without the northern kingdom to protect it, Judah was entirely at the mercy of the Philistines. David, born in Judah, though long since having abandoned any attachment to it, had been acting as a Philistine mercenary in the region for more than a year, and he proved himself capable. We may even imagine that rule over Judah was David's reward for having helped the Philistines. David helped the Philistines defeat King Saul, and his reward is the vassal kingship of Judah. Put that one in your pipe and smoke it for a minute when you think about David. There's no notice in the text that David turned against his Philistine masters when he became the king of Judah. The Philistines seem to have accepted his kingship without complaint. In fact, this whole period of David's rule in Hebron seems to have been one of newfound peace with the Philistines, which is entirely sensible, since the Philistines had defeated the northern kingdom and were now in control of the southern region through David. Judah would one day be independent, but it was created as a Philistine territory led by a Philistine vassal, or you could say even puppet king. And this is David. So think about that. Think about what sense that makes. David had 7 years of peace at Hebron and the Philistines never attacked his claim as king. And there's no recorded military history of David during that period. It's because he was claiming Judah for the Philistines. And this is how he became the vassal king of Judah. So, and this is why he's not also the king of the north, Israel in the north, because the Philistines hold that. They gave him Judah for helping defeat Saul. So, support for this reconstruction can be found in the Bible itself. The entire narrative of David's anointing in Hebron and his reign over Judah is absent from the book of Chronicles. Now, remind you, you've got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Those 6 books chronicle the history of Israel's kings. 1st Samuel contains the apologetic of David. 2nd Kings Kings not so much, Chronicles not at all. And so in the book of Chronicles, there's not a single word of David's anointing in Hebron by the men of Judah. And if this was the high point of his royal career, as it would seem to the modern reader, why would Chronicles, which goes to such lengths to glorify David, even above and beyond what we find in Samuel, not mention a word of it? Why is this period of David's career treated almost as an embarrassment? We don't talk about Saul's death period. It's ignored. It's ignored out of existence. Just like the unseemly events of his time in the wilderness. Something about this story must have seemed absolutely unacceptable to the authors of the books of Chronicles, which are in the Old Testament. Whether it was the historical recollection of what David's Judahite kingdom really was, or a keen reading of the story in Samuel, Chronicles seem to have understood that this ostensibly glorious moment was anything but. And the Bible presents David's kingship over Judah as almost a foregone conclusion. It's this spontaneous moment where David is crowned king. It's a moment of popular acclamation of God's chosen monarch when David was anointed by Samuel the prophet when he was a young man. But the reality is really far less appealing than that. And David became king in Judah through intimidation and coercion, probably because he had the Philistine army at his back. The towns of Judah coalesced into a nation not by choice, but by force. David's reign was based not on love, but on fear. And he ruled not as a Judahite, but he ruled as the servant of the Philistines. Think about that for a minute. This is who David was. Yeah, it's been deceived and it's been coded out, says Kat. That's true. The same guy, or some guy, stole some cloth or shawl, put it under his tent, and his whole family was swallowed up by the earth after leaving Egypt while they were on the wilderness. But then you got David. This wouldn't be the first time some Israelites were swallowed up by the earth. Exactly. I'm going to go back a little further so I get some context on that. So let's go back a little bit. I want to see where you're at. Kat, nice to see you, by the way. Michelle, good to see you. Macabre, Sterling, good to see you. Susie Q, good to see you. Jama, good to see you. I don't know if it's Jama or Jama. Is it short or long, hard or soft? So good to have you here, though. Jeannie, good to see you too. And saw Melinda. I'm just going through the list of who's here. And so I think I hit y'all. But let's look at this. Some of the things you had to said. Michelle asked me, Ugh, need to replay the stat, Scotty. Need the replay stat. Oh, says Michelle. Okay. If you're talking about this show, it'll get there. It'll be there within probably 20 minutes of my being done here. Don't forget to go buy the cool stuff and support Cannoli and Meatball. Absolutely right. StreamingTalkRadio.com. Use this code July4 to get a discount on all the garments, all my designs that we put on garments. Go get them. Still haven't done a David one. I'm going to get one done up here. I started to work on it a little bit today. I want it to be something that you'll be interested to wear, not just like the cover of a book or something. I want it to be a cool design, maybe a little dark, but something about King David. We'll get that done up too. So go see the designs we've got up there. We've got patriotic designs, and I do all the designs myself. So, these are by my hand. So stuff on Senenmut from the Exodus reality. Got stuff on the reptilians. I don't have anything on the Nephilim up there now, I don't think. But we're going to have something on David. I've got all my patriotic tees. Go get them. 20% off. That means for every $10 you spend, you're getting 2 taken off the top. So July 4 is the code. Remember that when you go in. You'll find the link to the Etsy site. Son of a Patriot is my site for that. You'll find it over at streamingtalkradio.com. Thanks, Audrey, for putting that up. And let's see. Hello, my fellow Rapscallions, says Sterling. Good to see you, brother. Need the replay stat, says Michelle. I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to there. Scotty, washing dishes, says Kat. I was doing that the other night. Matter of fact, just a few minutes before I came rushing into here at 9 o'clock Central Standard Time, I was working on the lawnmower with my wife. So she's pretty handy. Not only is she a babe and she's hot and all of that stuff, she can pick up the lawnmower, tip it upside down, and start working on it. It's my wife. Totes the barge and lifts the bale. Let's see. Michelle, missed all of you. Scotty, of course. Just in from out of town. Weird Al concert. Good to have you back, Michelle. Yeah, Al, says Susie Q. There's a recipe for the anointing oil used to anoint the king of Israel. Oh, Jama, I'd like to see that. It's in the Bible. Okay. Semen, sacred secretion ointment. That's what Kat says. That's one kind, probably. Let's see, Melinda Biddle. If you can find the passage for that, Jama, I'd love to see that. Jama. Sorry, it's not double M's, so I don't know how you pronounce that exactly with the right tone. It's like, is it Anna or Anna? So there you go. It's like my little kids when the Disney movie, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, came out. They were listening to a news story once, and this is many years ago now. If you remember Tom Hulse doing the voice of Quasimodo in the Disney cartoon, and my kids heard something about football being played at Notre Dame University, and they said, "It's not Notre Dame, Dad. It's Notre Dame." And I got that. So Jama. I think it's Jama. So there you go. The House of Naphtali were the warriors. Yes. So says Sterling Macabre. Where did the lost tribes go? That's the diaspora. The Neosporin. Says Cat. Let's see. The Caucasians. Yeah, that's one place. I think they've been all over the place. They definitely were in Europe, that diaspora. So, of course, to them at the time, I'll draw that on a wall. Europe, Russia, Australia, the U.S., scattered all over the world as promised. And you're right, Jama. That's exactly what happened to the diaspora. But at the same time, we shrug our shoulders. Exactly. We don't really know. I think the lost tribes went so far north, the earth swallowed them, says Macabre, Sterling. I'm saying Macabre so people know whose comment I'm talking about. Scott's World says hello. I don't know about the north thing, Macabre, but I don't think they're swallowed unless you're just, being like all of us, being a little facetious, a little fun with it. Wouldn't be the first time some Israelites will swallowed up by the earth. That's where the context of that came from. Let's see. Oh, Jama. There you go. I wasn't deliberately fucking with you, I swear. I wasn't sure how you pronounced that. Jama. Now I will never forget it. Jama. I was just having a little fun with your name because I couldn't think of the pronunciation. So there you go. Story of your friggin' life. Get it. I get it. Can we get to the rush? Can we get them rush? LOL for the 4th. I don't have anything to do with that because it's shipped out from the manufacturers. I've set up accounts with them and they do all the shipping. I would say if you want them for the 4th, order them now. Order them tonight. You might get them in time for the 4th. Can't guarantee that, but you might. Just go take a look at them and see what you like. Give it a shot. Susie, that's the best I can tell you. Let's see. Where are we? Jama says, okay, never mind. I'm a bad mama Jama. Amanda, welcome, by the way. I didn't see you earlier. John, good to see you, brother. Senecal. Damn straight lawnmower. Love it. That's right. And I will say that when my wife wants to get to my heart, she mows the lawn. So let's see. Let's move on. Honored, still listening. Appreciate that, Cat. Amanda, you got a great name. I don't know if you go by Mandy or Manda or any of those. I like Amanda. I like the name. So I have a dear friend who's Amanda. Somebody I dated before I met my wife. And she's a friend of my wife's now as well. Always called her Mandy. So good name. Let's see. Jama. Yes. Jama. So it doesn't mean I won't ever say Jama again when I slip. So Amanda's when you're in trouble. Amanda. What's your middle name, Amanda? That's when you know you're really in trouble. I say to my kids, Flynn Liam Roberts. So you can call me Jama. Jammers. Jammers? Would that be Jammers or Jammers? Jam on? Pajamas. PJs. Oh, you'd be a PJ now. How about that? Josephine. Amanda Josephine, what the hell are you up to? All right. So et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. It's 9:15. Let's see if we can do a little bit more. I can talk about the state of the north in Israel at this time, Abner's betrayal. Abner is the general that was under Saul. And so we got a lot left. The death of Ishbal. This is very important in the rise of David's kingship. And then finally, David, the king of Israel. And then he has to deal with Saul's descendants. That's coming up. Meribal, one descendant of Saul that remained alive, Meribal. And remember, David said he promised to honor the house of Saul. So there's all those sections are left in this section before we get to David's kingdom and the myth of the national and religious origins of the whole kingdom of David. So I think what we could do here, I'm looking to see here, all this material I've got down here. I want to see how far I want to try to take us tonight. I could take us up to Abner's. Maybe. I'm just looking through my notes, guys. I want to see how much of this I can get through. So we got through David, the king of Judah. We've established. And does that surprise you? If any of you, I'm very curious to know from you. If you grew up with a synagogue background or a Christian Sunday school background or Bible school, even anything like that, or you knew about these things just in church, just as being, if that was your religion, Judeo-Christianity, does any of this stuff about David surprise you? That the story that we have learned about David isn't really who David was. First Christian Church, says Jama. And as you all know, I was a very Baptist conservative fundamentalist church. Went into evangelical free church. And Melinda says, none, never really read it. I'm new. Well, this is the story of King David. And Melinda, as you know, and many of us already know, we already know some things about David. Played the harp, wrote the Psalms, killed the giant Goliath. And Amanda, Baptist and Church of England. That's quite a mix there. That's almost Protestant and Catholic. Isn't Church of England is just the Protestant version of the Catholic Church. So if you heard these stories, they're surprising. And I got to hail back to Jeff and what he teaches, this whole unindoctrinate yourself. If you're unindoctrinating yourself, you obviously were indoctrinated into something. And that's where I was. That's where a lot of us were. Church of God of Prophecy. And that was that. End of it for me, says Jama. Yeah, I was only ever really, I was baptized as a 5-year-old into the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. My mom's second husband, not my father, my stepfather, was a Ukrainian man, Vasil Nikolajenko, who just recently passed away. In his 80s, tough old guy. He and his family were in Stalin's concentration camps in the 50s, and they escaped and they made it to America, and they settled here. And my mom married him after she was divorced from my father, so he wanted us to grow up in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And about the time I was 5, I think, is when he took us to be baptized into the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I remember the night, 5-year-old in my little suit, and I had something I was carrying. I want to say it was like a little silver box that was given to me. And it was for the baptism, if I remember that right. I don't remember the origins of the box or what was in it. If any of you are Orthodox, and you might know, I was given this. I remember walking down the aisle and looking, and it was in the evening, so it was dark outside, but it was dark in this big, beautiful church. All the gilded this and the statuary, all the candles lit. I mean, it was really, in my mind's eye, just a glorious picture of holiness as you conceive that as a child. And so I was baptized into that church. And then they were divorced when I was 6. And I was 11 years old when I met the old guy. His name was Bill Fisher. And I say old guy. He was only 2 years older than I am right now when I met him. And but at the time, as an 11-year-old, he was an old guy. And he was a bricklayer and a stonemason. And he invited me to go to church. He was out on a Saturday canvassing neighborhoods, looking for kids. They used a big school bus and picked up kids for Sunday school. And I went the next morning and I got saved. I was born again the next morning at church. And Bill became my mentor. He became my friend. My mom had been looking for one of those, the Big Brothers organizations. She was looking for a big brother for my brother and I to have a male role model. Because it had been years. It had been 5 years since she'd been married to Nikola Jenko, my stepdad. And so Bill actually said, look, I'll take that on. And he wasn't official through the organization, but he taught me his trade. He took me to work with him, taught me how to build fireplaces, stonemasonry, all of that stuff. We went camping. I went to stay at his wife. He and his wife had a place out north of us. His son, and by the way, Bill died of cancer about 4 or 5 years after I met him. I was, I think, 15 when he passed away. And that was heart-wrenching at the time because he was like my dad for 4 or 5 years. And now, mind you, that was in 1976 that he passed away. Just about 2 years ago, his son, who is now in his 80s, I believe, he was like superintendent of schools of someplace in California, this big intellectual guy and all of this. His son looked me up out of the blue to send me a book that he had written, some of his memoirs, and sent me that book. He thought of me 40 years after the fact. And I was surprising he even remembered who I was. But apparently even in Bill's family, it was a big thing that Scotty was this kid that Bill took on, was mentor to. So all of that to say, that's my background religiously. That's how I got into the faith I was in. And I stayed in that church all the way up through my college days and my seminary days. So there you go. N or indoctrination, Professor Bauer says, can be reversed if you choose. Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. Let's see. Everyone else is Roman Catholic, says Amanda. Making good, strong, awesome men to show my boys how things work. And just a good role model. Absolutely. So, all right. Let me move on just a little bit here. It's now 10:23. You know what? I might not go any further with David tonight. Only because, let me take a look at what I got here. The state of the north in Israel. It's unclear, really, just how long David waited after becoming the king in Judah to begin confronting Saul's former kingdom. Presumably, he wouldn't have waited long because Israel would never be as weak as it was immediately after the death of Saul. So it's not surprising then that virtually the first thing we hear after the anointing of David by the men of Judah in Hebron is that he turned to the north. And the situation in Israel after the battle at Mount Gilboa was understandably unsettled. Not only Saul, but 3 of his sons, the heirs to his throne, had all died on the slopes of Mount Gilboa at that famous battle with the Philistines. And such a situation could hardly be planned for, although I'm sure they thought there might be a day we aren't going to have King Saul, especially for a first-generation monarchy like that of Israel. Jonathan, Saul's eldest son, it says the man who he and David had this relationship was closer than the bond of a man and a woman. Best friends, besties, BFFs. He'd been primed to succeed his father by leading part of Saul's army, but of Saul's sons after Jonathan, we've heard nothing to this point in the story. Almost certainly because they had no significant position in the military or administration of the northern kingdom. And even if Saul did have other sons, and it turns out that he did, their claim to the throne would be based solely on the principle of lineal royal succession, a rather tentative basis for power so early in a monarchy, Saul being the first of the monarchy. There was no precedent established in Israel other than what they saw from other nations. The people of Israel must have been really uncertain about their future at that point when Saul's dead. But remember, Saul being the first king, they're still fresh out of the period of the judges. So maybe they're thinking, we're going to revert right back to the situation of the judges as opposed to having a king. So David tried to take advantage of this situation, as anyone who's seeking power would. And he tried to take advantage in the north almost immediately. Not militarily at first, but diplomatically. He sent a message to the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead, the town that had taken Saul's body down from the wall and given it a proper burial. The Bible records this message, though it's undoubtedly not the very words that David actually sent. According to 2 Samuel 2, 5-7, David blessed Jabesh Gilead for its act of faithfulness to Saul, hoped for God's blessing on the town, and offered David's own reward along with not so subtle suggestion. Listen to this. It's a quote, "Now take courage and be valiant, men, for your lord Saul is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." So whatever David may have really said, this last line probably sums it up fairly accurately. He suggests that with Saul no longer able to protect Jabesh Gilead, the town would be awfully smart. Or as in the Bible puts it, with almost a wink and a nod, valiant. You'd be valiant to follow the examples of Judah and make David their king as well. Fat Tony should be very, very happy should you make David king. Be valiant, be brave, blah, blah, blah. Do what's good for you. I mean, good for David. I mean, that's the way this comes across. So, unlike Judah, which was essentially defenseless and had been subject to David's displays of power for some time, the far northern town of Jabesh Gilead was under no direct threat from David. I was like, whatever. This was true diplomacy. David had nothing to back up his words, and they seem to have fallen on deaf ears. So in part, this might have been because in the vacuum created by Saul's death, a new power figure in the north had begun to emerge. And this was not one of Saul's sons, but rather Saul's general, Abner. That Saul's general should have taken up the reins of leadership, though, as we'll see, not the reign itself, is unsurprising. We need to not look far ahead in our modern world to recognize that the fall of an established government is often succeeded by military rule, and especially if nobody's in place to fill the gap. And as we've seen, royal power was predicated first and foremost on a person's ability to command the military, which is why the kings like Saul and princes like Jonathan made leading the troops a priority. You had to lead your troops because this is how the people saw you had the power. And this is why, basically, another symbol of the power was when David slept with Saul's wife, took her for his own wife, had a kid with her. He was threatening the power of Saul. This is why Saul sought to kill him, not because he was jealous of David. So you've got Abner rising up, and without this credible military leader from the immediate line of the royal descent, the most important military leader from the immediate line of the royal descent would have been in a position of significant power in the vacuum without King Saul or a successor. And Abner would have to wield this power in sometimes unexpected ways for the relatively brief remainder of his life. It's a little foreshadowing there I gave you. You didn't see that. The relatively brief remainder of his life. All right? So Abner probably could have proclaimed himself king in Israel. Saul's cousin. He was at least from the right family, and yet he didn't. Instead, he put Saul's son Ishbal on the throne. The standard royal succession notwithstanding, it's clear that this was truly Abner's doing. Even the Bible says that Abner took Ishbal, the son of Saul, and made him king over Gilead. The Asherites, Jezreel, Ephraim, and Benjamin over all of Israel. And by the way, if you note that the difference between Judah and Israel, north and south, you will see this all through the monarchy. There was David and Solomon basically had the united monarchy of Judah and Israel. After the time of Solomon, it started splitting up again. It became the nation of Israel, the nation of Judah, north and south, but still all considered Israel. All right, the standard royal succession is overlooked, and Ishbal is put in place by the general Abner. And it seems to have been by Abner's will, his force, his coercion, he communicated to Saul's former territories that Ishbal assumed his father's place because he was the surviving son. And Abner acted as the kingmaker rather than as the king. He was the William Wallace to Robert the Bruce. He was the kingmaker. And this was the smarter decision. The northern kingdom of Israel was hardly a choice to rule, given its military and political situation vis-a-vis the Philistines and David to the south. They'd be kind of sandwiched in there. Remember, David is being looked at now in Judah as the vassal king of the Philistines. So he's got the Philistines to the north and south now. Abner, the general, he's putting Ishbal on the throne. There was no guarantee that the kingdom would survive for much longer. King of Israel might be a relatively dangerous position to hold. And by establishing himself as the real power behind the throne, Abner could control the kingdom to a degree while keeping himself kind of safe. He's not the monarch. And should Ishbal falter, Abner would be able to deflect any criticism from himself, especially as he had done the right thing by maintaining the expected royal succession in Israel. So who's this Ishbal guy? We haven't heard about him up until this point. He's the new king of Israel. We know remarkably little about him from the biblical text. He doesn't appear in the Bible before Abner makes him king. That's how insignificant he was. Evidently, he was of little consequence before his father and his 3 elder brothers were killed. And almost all we know is his name, and the Bible has obscured even that, because in Samuel, he's not called Ishbal, but Ishbosheth. So, these 2 versions of his name. And like many Israelite names, his is a combination of 2 words. The first, Ish, means man. The second, at least it appears in Samuel, Bosheth means shame or disgrace. It's a disgraceful man, shameful man, man of shame, man of disgrace. How would you like to be named that? And the second, at least, it appears in Samuel, Bosheth, meaning shame or disgrace. This is not a comment on his character, but it's a well-known biblical application of his real name, Baal, or Baal. Baal, B-A-A-L. Recognize that name in Israelite culture, Palestinian, Canaanite culture. Baal was the god Baal and Asherah, the god and goddess of the pagans there, which is both a proper noun meaning Lord, and more famously, the name of the main Canaanite deity, Baal. The same Baal that Elijah famously proves powerless on Mount Carmel, if you remember that scene. Thus, Ishbal's name, or Ishbosheth, meant man of Baal, man of the Lord, the dark Lord. Here and elsewhere, biblical scribes, perhaps embarrassed that an Israelite should even have a name glorifying a foreign god, replaced this divine name with a pejorative name. To be fair to Ishbal, or to Saul, who named him, in the early years of Israel, Baal seems to have been used to denote the Israelite God, Yahweh. And we shouldn't think that Saul worshipped a Canaanite deity at this point. Later, however, any association with Baal would have been unthinkable, and hence the alteration to the text. All right, guys, I'm not done with this section, but I'm going to quit only because I got our show to do with Rocky. Losing my voice. I got to go tend to it now before it's totally gone. Hold on. Let's take a sip of water. So there we go. Let's see. Google is playing games. This is the third time I've watched one of Scotty's or Jeff's live videos and my PC shut off. Wonder what that's all about. Anyway, I'm going to call it quits there. We're going to pick up there tomorrow night. We're going to be talking about Ishbosheth being put on the throne by Abner, and get into this a little bit more, how David starts coalescing his kingdom and how people start dying around him and how the Bible apologists try to cover that up. So, yes, pejorative. Macabre, Sterling, hey, Roberts, good job, buddy. Thank you. You're welcome. Good job to you, too. Thanks for being there. And so there you go. Thanks for being here, folks. Remember to go see our site, streamingtalkradio.com. Go buy some shirts and hoodies and some of the stuff we have over at Son of a Patriot. The link is right over there on Talk Radio, streamingtalkradio.com. Wow. There was a little synapse that did not fire. So, yeah, I'm going to go gargle a little bit and try to soften my throat for the Situation Room with Rocky Stucci, which comes on in about 23 minutes. So thank you for being here tonight. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. It means a hell of a lot to me. Like this video, please. Share it. And we'll see you back here again tomorrow. So have a good night. We'll see you over on Rocky's show. Good night.